Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth. This program features in-depth conversations with the leading names in the subjects of UFOs, abductees, the paranormal, panel discussions, and the very best and brightest of the next generation of writers and researchers. Meanwhile Here on Earth, the show breaking new ground in alternative talk with your intrepid host, veteran investigative writer and researcher, Peter Robbins.
Thank you, Mr. Race Hobbs. And yes, it's true. This is Meanwhile Here on Earth. And I am your host, Peter Robbins, and this is our very first show of the new year on January 2nd. I hope you all had a very good Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, Festivus, whatever. Happy New Year. And a memorable year. It looks like it's going to be one way or the other. My guest tonight, and the reason I'm pre-recording this show is because they're both in beautiful Yorkshire, UK, England. And if we were doing this live, we would be beginning at midnight for them and ending at 2 a.m., which in some cases is against the Geneva Convention. So I thought, let's err on the side of kindness. My first guest is Chris Evers. Chris's interest in the unusual began in 1974 after spotting in the early evening skies a series of quirky light movements in the darkness traveling toward him. This led to his reading many of the available books at the time about what were known as UFOs. Titles such as Flying Saucers Are Real, Flying Saucers from Outer Space, and of course the Flying Saucer Conspiracy, authored by the distinguished author, a U.S. Marine pilot, Donald Kehoe, and one of the first and most respected names in serious UFO research in the States and by extension the world. But as well as British authors such as The Warminster Mystery by Arthur Shuttlewood and others like The Welsh Triangle by Peter Paget. In the late 1970s, part of Pembrokeshire and Sidgerton, oh God, I butchered that one, but you'll help me out with that when we come back, became a hotspot for reports of UFO activity. It was known as the Dryfield Triangle, centered on Broadhaven. Chris's interest in the subject began to grow during the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. He became an avid viewer of any television programs such as Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World and similar shows, all expanding his knowledge and interest in the strange subject we call ufology. Like many of that time, he enjoyed the interest in the subject that the TV series The X-Files brought globally. In the mid-1990s, he was the driving force behind the setting up and running of his local UFO society, which he headed for several years. Chris became an investigator for Quest International, which was run by former North Yorkshire policeman, who is sadly no longer with us, Tony Dodd, a great name in UFO research. He was a contributor on occasion to Graham and Ian Birdsall's British version of UFO magazine, which I think in its time was the finest all-round UFO magazine ever in print. Now, of course, print is pretty arcane for many. Chris had the privilege of knowing both Graham and Mark, not Ian Birdsall, and sadly, he attended Graham's funeral in the early years of the new millennium. I was there too. Chris was honored to first talk with noted author and eventual 2018 Outer Limits magazine award winner Paul Sinclair in the mid-1990s about events surrounding Paul's own experiences, offering what advice and support he could about Chris's experiences. Paul encouraged Chris to establish Outer Limits magazine, and of course gone on to become a good friend to many of us. Chris spent a few years away from the subject, returning in 2014. when he established Outer Limits magazine in 2 years later, making it a subscriber-only publication with issue 17. No, that's out of date now. The magazine was created, of course, to share information, its tagline being "Be Informed." Outer Limits magazine, better known to many of us as OLM, part funds our yearly conferences in the UK, with regular contributors from many, including Philip Mantle, Paul Sinclair, Ronald and Philip Kinsella, Paul Askoff, the great Malcolm Robinson, in America, Earl Grey Anderson, Kathy Tierney Cagliano, the late great Calvin Parker, and many more, myself included in there. Far too many to mention here, but each contributor is precious to OLM. Without their articles, the magazine would not exist, and the conferences would be harder to fund. Chris is extremely grateful for all of the continuing contributions to the magazine, now and in the future. Outer Limits magazine's yearly conferences have featured many notable speakers, including Philip Mantle, Malcolm Robinson, Mary Rodwell, Russell Callahan, John Hanson, Peter Robbins, Colonel Charles I. Halt, Sasha Christie of Liverpool, and others. Chris also speaks at these events. He attended and spoke at the first RAW, Research and Witness, 2-day event in his hometown of Hull in 2020, just before the first UK COVID lockdown. A smaller bio, but the tip of an iceberg. Philip Mantle is a long-standing UFO researcher and author from the UK. He joined the newly formed Yorkshire UFO Society in 1980. He was formerly the Director of Investigations for the British UFO Research Organization, better known as BUFORA, and the Mutual UFO Network, known as MUFON, representative for England. He is the founder of Flying Disc Press, which has published so many quality UFO books over the years. And without further ado, Chris Evers, Philip Mantle, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth.
Hi, Peter. Great to see you.
Good evening, Peter.
And good afternoon to you. It is 5 hours between us, but with friends, it really isn't an issue. Chris, you and I have known each other for some years now. Philip, you and I go back 25 years, dare I say, to that extraordinary year of 1997, the 50th anniversary of the modern era of UFOs, and we have been friends since then. This is actually a double pleasure in that I'm not only getting to speak with, interview, have a conversation with two of my favorite colleagues in England, but also to kind of celebrate the fact that one of them, that being Philip Mantle, has now published the first book by Chris Evers, and a long time coming it has been. Philip and I, both published authors, and Philip really one of a handful of people in the publishing business worldwide who has specialized in getting quality UFO books out there into the world, has added a very special one. And you can kind of see part of the image behind Chris there. But here it is, The Shape of Things to Come from Elsewhere. And that pesky Peter Robbins did the foreword. I had to pay him to let me do it because I wanted the credit. But, oh, did I say that or think that? Oh, anyway.
I was thinking aloud, Peter.
One of the things that I kind of centered this show around is not just to feature the work of people who I think making interesting and valuable contributions to this field and other fields, but who are living interesting, dedicated lives. And it's driven in part by a childhood curiosity that I've addressed to almost every guest I've ever had, which has to do with how people in public life, people we may look up to or deride, people whose work we follow in one form or another. They could be composers or painters or authors. Um, Whatever they did to bring themselves into public life, how did they get there? And for a while, what I'd like to do is go back and forth between the two of you so that by the time we start to talk about the book and Flying Disc Press, we have an idea of how you guys arrived at that point in your lives where you started to actively do this work. And Chris, I'd like to start with you. You were born in Hull as well as living there, really your life.
That's correct. Yeah. 1960, I was born here in Kingston upon Hull. I had my own experience, my first experience here in 1974, which you so rightly mentioned. I had a second experience not too far away from the city of Hull, only about 10 miles on the outside of the city, at a place called Brough, which is on the northern bank of the River Humber. Which is actually an estuary. As you mentioned, the first experience I had was a series of lights kind of leapfrogging across the sky, till eventually they got above my position where a group of lads, myself included, were playing war, basically. And we had, it was an early February evening. It was dark. And we'd gone home, had our evening meal. I'd gone outside with a couple of friends to spend a bit of time together before we got back home, for the rest of the evening. We'd been pretty lucky with the weather. This particular night, no rain, no snow or anything like that for a number of days. Anyway, we're hiding away. We'd split into two equal teams, hiding away on top of a hill, a mud mound, basically. And I happened to notice this pinprick of light leapfrog across the sky, got directly above my position. And I jumped up and shouted, "Look, guys, there's a UFO in the sky." Didn't know, actually, what a UFO was. I only called it a UFO because I was a fan of Jerry Anderson, Stingray, Thunderbirds, and, of course, the TV show UFO. Which was actually about Ed Straker and the Shadow Organization protecting the Earth from invading aliens who were coming to take body parts to transplant into their own aliens. So I wonder where that comes from. Anyway, I carried on. I jumped up into the sky, and as I jumped up, shouted, "Guys, there's a UFO." It blinked out and completely disappeared, and it was a completely cloudless. You could see practically every single star in the evening sky, in the early evening sky, and it never carried on moving. It moved from more or less the southwestern position to a northeastern position, but directly above me, it disappeared. And then my second sighting, back in the mid-1990s, when I was running the Hull UFO Society, a ball of light came down the hillside on the opposite bank of the River Humber. It came out onto the River Humber, split into two different things, orbs, if you want to call them that, and went in two different directions. I'm watching it go to my right, going up the River Humber, which is actually an estuary. And anyway, excuse me, after a few moments, it disappeared. And I turned to the two people who were with me. I said, "Oh, it's gone." And they said, "No, it hasn't. It's gone to the left under the Humber Bridge," which was about 2 or 3 miles a bit further down the river. So that's how we knew it came and split into two different directions. These things have kept me fascinated with the subject since the mid-1970s, basically, and it's 50 years this year.
I'm going to stop you there for a moment, and we're going to come back to this. But let's go back earlier. Growing up as a kid, not involved in the subject of UFOs, first, did you have a dream of what you wanted to be as an adult when you were a youngster, in elementary school, or that was to come?
Back in the late 1960s, early 1970s, I was very much into my music. And I wanted to be in a band. I wanted to be famous in a band.
Classic.
Put it simply, if the Beatles could do it, if the Beatles could do it, I could do it. Unfortunately, that never happened.
That's the attitude.
So, I carried on basically just I wanted to join the RAF. Once I got to about 15, 16, I wanted to join the RAF. Unfortunately, that was taken away from me because at the age of 17, I developed type 1 diabetes.
Oh, for God's sake.
It actually took that away from me. So pretty soon after I developed my diabetes, I became a technical optician. And I went basically through many different jobs, no real career, just going from job to job, so on and so forth. And that's basically where I was back in 1976. I got married young. I had a family young. And, we were together for quite a number of years. And we eventually broke up in the early 1990s. And then I met my present wife, Jeanette, who is, she's the best thing. She's sliced bread, really, She's fantastic, supports me in absolutely everything I do. And I just want to say thank you for that, if she's listening, because I know I can be awkward at times. So, but yeah, that's basically me and my life story, basically, Peter.
Hold that thought. Philip, you were born in Yorkshire. Where? West Yorkshire, correct?
Yeah, I was born just
Originally?
outside. Yeah, I was born just outside of the city of Wakefield in West Yorkshire, which is about 50 miles approximately from where Chris is. So it's not that far.
Okay.
Yeah, I lived in a little mining village called East Ardsley, and it was a world away from anything, Peter. It really was very different.
It sounds like, well, to an American, even one like me who has been to England 20, 25 times, there's still a certain romance and mystique. Growing up in that village, part of it must have been like, although it was your life and you don't compare it to other things, but looking back on it now, like growing up in part in an earlier time.
Oh, it was great, Peter. I mean, it was only a small place. The man I call my father, he was actually my stepfather. He worked down the coal mine all his life.
Wow.
He served in the military during the Second World War and was injured. He was wounded in action, but he managed to hop along. After being demobbed, he went down the coal mines and stayed down the coal mines until he retired. So in the little place where we lived, you either worked in the mine or the railway. There was a mill still working. I think it's still going. So, you're all in the manual jobs.
Yeah.
And didn't make any difference to us when we didn't realize it at the time that we were probably poor, because everybody else was the same, Peter.
Yeah.
So we had no definition between what was poor and what was rich.
Yes.
We were loved unreservedly by our parents. My mum, God bless her, she was from Northern Ireland, and she and my two aunts were a force of nature. For 50 years, I thought my father's name was Shut Up, John, because that's what she would say to him as soon as he started to talk. And we had friends. There was a great sense of community. Everybody knew everybody. If your mum was ill, there'd be a knock on the door to see if they could help, or did you need anything from the grocers, and so on. And all that's gone now, but it was a great place to grow up. It really was.
These words, rich, poor, which are so relative, living, with endless amounts of money and excess, or a simpler life. The fact is, by a lot of people's definitions, mine right at the top of the list, you were very wealthy growing up in the most important way. And
absolutely. I didn't realize anything different, Peter, until we had to move. The houses that we were in were being condemned.
Oh my gosh.
It was just that one street. It had structural problems, so it had to all be demolished. We were moved just a couple of miles away, but this time it was a council estate. And it was totally different. There was no community. You didn't even know your friends next door, And then I went to the local high school. And, of course, we didn't wear uniforms in those days. And it was only then I realized the difference because, we had nothing, basically. We were happy. clothed, fed, had a great, our house was always fun. But then you go to school and people there would have the latest Levi's or whatever, and you didn't. So it was then I realized the difference. I didn't care. It didn't bother me in the least, couldn't care less. And as for what I wanted to do when I left school, well, I was pretty gormless in my teenage years, Peter. I don't know if that's a word you use in America, gormless, but I think you'll get the gist of it, And if I could have got a qualification in dicking around, I would have had a degree. So I left.
I can just see it. The first, even a bachelor's in dicking around would be historic for any.
Yeah. So I just got a job. I got a job as an apprentice painter and decorator. I had no idea. I was useless at it, and I then got a few other jobs. But my saving grace, Peter, was as a youngster. And I don't know if this is the genesis of my interest. My mum told me a story of where she lived in Northern Ireland. It was quite a remote place. They lived on a little small holding. She had 2 sisters and 2 brothers and a little stream. And she said one day she met a fairy down by the stream. She conversed with it. It gave her a bottle to drink out of. And I asked her down the years, is this story real, Mum? And she said it was real to me. And in later years, she went on to tell my children that story, of course, her grandchildren.
Yes.
And I always had an interest in astronomy, the space program, especially being born in 1958.
Yeah.
The Apollo landings, but also the paranormal in general. I don't know where it came from. And I was fortunate because where we lived after we moved, literally my best friend's mum, who lived on the grandmother, lived on the opposite side of the road, and she used to go to the spiritualist church a couple of miles away. So on occasion I would go with her, and I found it fascinating. I didn't agree with what they were saying, but nonetheless I found it fascinating. So even though I was just going with the flow once I left high school, I always had that as an interest when I was at home. And like Chris, I would read anything I could. On the rare occasion there was a TV show about it, and he's lying about UFO. He's lying about the TV show UFO. You have no idea what the show was about. All you watched it for was the young ladies in those tight-fitting, scanty costumes. And I'm telling you now, that's exactly why you watched it. I'm honest enough to admit it.
The joke in the States used to be, yes, I buy Playboy and read it for the articles.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to ask you 2 questions, and I want to return to Chris. Going back early again, at a certain point in your life, maybe if you had a television, or if there was there a movie theater in the village that you grew up in?
No.
Okay. So your introduction to the world of film was by television?
So I'll tell you 2 stories. Where we lived in this village, it was a world away from anything, Peter. It was like our own little world. And I knew nothing of what went on outside of it. I mean, we had 1 bus an hour. And where the hell the bus went, I have no idea, because I never got on it,
It went someplace else.
So in East Ardsley, there's a big hill, and it's called Fall Hill. And where we live was down near the bottom. About halfway up, there was an old wooden hut, and it was like a community centre. And I will have been about 6 or 7, and they were having a recruiting drive there for kids to join the Cub Scouts. So me and 2 friends, I remember their names, me, Gary Howlett and Kevin Hoole, went because they were showing a film, a movie, and it was The Wizard of Oz.
Oh my gosh.
I'd never seen it,
Oh my gosh.
We got in.
This was your first film?
Well, no. We were only in there for about 4 minutes when they chucked us out, because we were so excited. We were making so much noise than it was, out you go. So I never got to sew it. And then later on, there was a family who lived just down the same street from us, and had a lot of children. The eldest one was about 18, and he was called Jeffrey. And he took us to a town called Morley, which was about, 4 miles away. And they had a cinema there. And the first movie I ever saw was Mary Poppins.
Oh my gosh.
And I think it cost us a shilling to get in, a shilling. I think it was, 6pence on the bus, and I had 2 and 6. So with my bus fare and my entry, I had 6pence left, and that bought us an ice cream, And I tell you what, Peter, 2 and 6, which is 12.5p in today's money. 2 and 6 was
real
unheard
money.
of. I'd never seen it before, and it was amazing, And I've had a lifelong interest in the movies ever since, but yeah, Mary Poppins, and I still like it today. I mean, it's a great.
It's a lovely association.
Yeah.
Many of us, well, we all mastered the art of reading at different rates. I know people who, as very young children, smart and observant, couldn't wait to be instructed in reading and taught themselves essentially to do it. Being dyslexic, I really, it wasn't until I was about 8 years old that I was confident enough in my reading that I could get into, real grown-up books, or at least, ones more geared for my age. But were you much of a reader as a boy? And if so, what kind of books?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my mum, where she lived out in the wilderness in Ireland, never went to school hardly, Peter, but she could read and write, and she was a fantastic reader. She read right up until the day she died, So we always had books in the house. So I would read some of my mother's books. For example, when I went to high school, we had one lesson. It wasn't a church school. I couldn't understand why we had to sing a hymn every morning. No idea. But we used to have one lesson a week called religious instruction, not education, but instruction. And they would tell you, I can see this fella now, I can't remember his name, and it would tell you things in the Bible, not as if maybe this did happen or maybe this did, but as an actual fact. And you'd see my hand sneaking up to ask questions, and I'd get into trouble. So when I was about 14, I thought I'd better read the Bible because I'm getting in so much trouble. I better know what I'm talking about. So I did. I read it that year.
Good.
And so I had a little bit of backup, but I was a great reader, and I read a few books on the paranormal, astronomy. And what started my interest in the UFO subject, I read one book on astronomy. Can't remember the title, but it had one chapter in it on UFOs, basically dismissing them, which I found very odd.
That was classic strategy.
Well, there was other things astronomy. In this book from an astronomy point of view that were theoretical, so they weren't factual, they were just ideas and theories. And I thought, well, why would you rule this out and accept that? So when I left school, the interest remained. I read a couple of more books, got to the age of 20, and over the winter of 1978 into 1979, known in Britain as the winter of discontent, by the way, because there were strikes everywhere.
Wow. I
was in Germany, West Germany as it was then, working, and couldn't speak the language. So pointless watching this will make you laugh. I went to watch down in the city. I went to watch the first Superman movie. Me thinking it would be in English with German subtitles.
Of course.
They had dubbed it into German. They dubbed it, and it's the funniest thing you have ever seen in your life, Peter.
Sometimes dubbed movies are hysterical unintentionally.
So I phoned my mum up and said, "Can you send me some books, Mum?" So she said, "No problem, son." And this parcel arrived. It was a box, and it was packed with UFO books, paperbacks. I think she bought them on the local market. So I would sit there after work on a night, reading it. So when I came back home in 1979, I had a bit more of knowledge about the subject. And then we lived about 5 miles from the city of Leeds. Later in the year, my aunt, who lived round the corner, she brought me the local newspaper. It was called the Yorkshire Evening Post, and it still is, still published in Leeds. And in it was a small advertisement for the formation of the Yorkshire UFO Society that coming Sunday at a place called Centenary House on North Street in Leeds. As you probably know, Peter, back in 1979 on a Sunday, Britain used to close, but nonetheless, I got on the bus into Leeds.
I remember.
Yes. Yeah, I found Centenary House, and it was a big place, and I could hear this room that obviously was occupied, so off I went. There was the Yorkshire UFO Society with Graham and Mark Birdsall. They'd set it up. They put on a presentation because they'd obviously already been involved a few years. And I just felt I'd found my niche in life. Almost instantly, that was it. I was hooked, and away we went.
Hold that thought. Chris, going back to your childhood, and I want to preface this by saying I grew up watching movies, and to this day, film is an integral part of my life. It's hard to imagine my life without it. Many people don't grow up like that. Movies and film, even television shows, are just not part of it. Other things that they're doing, other things that they're involved in. What was your introduction, Chris, to the world of film and early television memories? What kind of shows did you gravitate toward? Again, we're talking pre-14 years old, as young as you remember.
Yeah, I was a big history fan. I could tell you when the first Spitfire flew, or when the first Orca Hurricane flew. And Second World War I was quite interested in.
Yes, me too.
But because of that, I used to like the John Wayne movies, which we would get on TV across here. One of the first movies I particularly remember going to see was a movie all about the Battle of Britain, which was simply called the Battle of Britain.
I remember the film.
Yeah, I think this was about 1968, somewhere around about there.
And they had, at the time, of course, they had Spitfires and Hurricanes and Stukas, and it was especially for those of us who grew up in the shadow of World War II, our dads fought there, our grandfathers or whatever. Yep. War is a monster. War is hell. War is ugly. But that perception of fighting the good fight. My dad, who was in the Army Air Corps, used to refer to World War II as the good war. The fascists, proto-fascist Nazis on one side, and forces aspiring for democracy on the other. I was about to say, if only we had wars like that now. What a terrible thought. War is hell, and right now we're in the middle of just one of the worst times. God knows where it's all going. But
absolutely,
I can see that film having an impact on you for sure. Other early films,
TV wise,
TV
wise, Peter, it was, as you mentioned, we mentioned earlier, things like Star Trek, which the original series, which came over to the UK around about 69, 70, round about there. But I was also quite interested in Doctor Who. I remember Patrick Troughton being the second Doctor, and I forgot his name now. Was it William Hartnell who was the first Doctor? I remember watching this and complaining because my younger brother, who was 3 years younger than me, would hide behind the settee when the Daleks came on, and my mum said, "Right, you're gonna have to turn it off. You can't watch that," blah blah blah. So we used to sulk, but that's the kind of things that I was interested in.
As a boy, were you much of a reader? And if so, what kind of books were you drawn toward?
Oh, good heavens, yeah. I used to go down to my uncle's on a regular basis, which is actually where I would read some of the books on UFOs and so on. But he was mostly into like ghost stories, so I would read the occasional ghost story, you know, when I was staying at his home, and scare myself to death and go to sleep with a light on, you know. So there was those kind of things that I remember reading. But I was into things like Lord of the Rings. You know, all three books. I had a big volume of that. I also read the Beatles autobiography by the biography anyway by Hunter Davis. I remember reading that when I was about 8-9 years old. So, you know, I've always been into reading, I like reading, and that naturally led into me joining the local lending library and getting the UFO books out that, you know, I later found. So reading has always been there for me.
Philip, going back to where we left off, you meet the Birdsall brothers, who there are many people listening, watching, who don't know who they are. For you and I, they're kind of legends, but for me, especially, I have to say, I was not surprised. I was heartbroken, and he meant enough to me that the only time in my life that I've ever traveled to England just to attend the funeral of a friend was for Graham. He published, he and Mark, of course, they published I Spy too, but UFO magazine, not in any way to be confused with the American magazine of the same name, in its time. And again, remembering before the internet was, you know, the force that it is now, doing a monthly publication, a print publication with all that entailed, and distribution and quality control, and making sure every fact in that issue was fully vetted, that you were dealing with the newest cases, the most recently breaking information. What can I say? It really wasn't a class by itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, Graham was a big man in every way, you know, certainly in size. Yeah. He was 6 foot plus, you know, I must have been 18 stone in his prime. Big personality. Mark was the younger brother. He was more quiet. He preferred to work in the background. And that, you know, that served as well. What a lot of people don't know is that UFO magazine had very humble beginnings. I paid my £2 membership to join the Yorkshire UFO Society, and eventually we published what was called the UFOS Journal, a newsletter. We thought it was marvelous, Peter, and it was done on a hand cranked cassette.
Yeah, exactly.
And then we stapled it, and then we progressed. Now, the HQ of the Yorkshire UFO Society was Mark Birdsall's flat, or apartment, as you would call it. And it was on the 7th floor of a block of flats. And we bought a printing machine, secondhand. And it arrived, and we were hoping that the lift was working to get this thing up 7 floors.
Oh, my God.
We had no idea how to work it. So we had to get a gentleman to come and show Mark how to work this printing machine, which he eventually did. We then published what was called Quest magazine, which was one up from the UFOS Journal. But again, it was printed out and we would staple it together.
Yep.
200 copies. And again, we thought this was marvelous, you know. And, you know, I left UFOS in the late 1980s, and then they went on to produce UFO magazine, and they took a huge risk, Peter, because they put their own money, you know, into it. Graham and Mark, Tony Dodd, one or two others. Now, if it didn't work, that money was gone.
That's right.
But in its heyday, I think it was selling something like 40,000 copies per issue.
Massive for a UFO publication.
Plus all the merchandise and DVDs that they sold. Plus, then we started again little conferences in Centenary House in their main room. And this one made me laugh. The first one we ever had, we'd hired the main room, which is like a school hall with a little stage. And Graham says, I want you to sort out the PA, Philip. You get as a public, we need a PA. So I rang Centenary House and asked if they had a public address system. They had a PA. And I spoke to the caretaker. And when I asked him, everything went quiet. And I thought, well, what's wrong? I'll ask him again. What I'd forgotten was that Centenary House was actually the building itself was the Deaf Association.
I have to say, especially for our listeners or viewers, as far as I'm concerned, going off on this tangent and talking about this particular colleague the way that we are is important and valuable. I had mentioned that I really wasn't surprised. I mean, I was shocked and, heartbroken like everyone when he died. But why I wasn't surprised was over the years, once I started to speak at the Leeds conferences, we just kind of locked onto each other like radar, and I would stay over the house occasionally. In fact, the last time I saw him, he had died in September, was the Christmas Eve before. I stayed over Christmas Eve and left on Christmas Day, made my way down to Suffolk, and ended up there with friends for Christmas dinner. But I remember we stayed up extremely late, and both of us, I was a smoker at the time, we were just smoking and drinking our way into the evening, talking about UFOs. And one of the things that came up was Graham was certainly, a positive person. And I wouldn't call it being a fatalist, but he felt he was going to die before he was 50. And he told me that. The reason was because his dad died before he was 50 and his uncles died before they were 50. Let's remember also that he was not only a father, but by then, did he have a grandchild by then? He had certainly lived, packed more.
Yeah, I know how he feels, Peter, because not my stepfather, but my biological father died when I was 2 years of age. He was only 48. My eldest brother had 2 heart attacks at the age of 48 and died when he was 61. I had a near fatal heart attack when I was 41, so I nearly did it. So I know how Graham felt in that respect. Yeah. But what you will have gleaned from your conversations with Graham is his huge sense of humor. And the fact
used to crack me up. I will share one story about,
that's why we go back to me ringing Centenary House.
Thinking about all those laughs that we would have.
Forgetting that it's the Deaf Association. So why in hell would they have a public address system? I made the mistake of telling Graham this. Of course, he nearly fell over with laughing. And he never, ever let me forget it, I can assure you. He had what he called it his rickets book, but it was in his head. So if there were if we ever did anything like that, it would, and himself, of course, he wasn't immune from that. He wasn't just having a laugh at other people's expense. It was himself as well. And as it turned out, I spoke at Graham's, what turned out to be his last conference in Leeds. He died the following year, and he'd been at conference organising them for 21 years. So what I did before I started my actual presentation, I kept him on the stage with me, and I showed the audience some of the old photographs from the very early days of the Yorkshire UFO Society and how it had progressed. And Graham's wife, Christine, was sat on the front row crying, because she'd been there through it. And I said, you come to these conferences, it looks easy, everything runs smoothly.
Yes.
But it's got a history behind it. It didn't start like that. One of the funniest things that Graham told me was he had Michael Hesseman as a speaker, Michael from Germany.
Yep.
And Michael's waiting backstage and Graham's doing the introduction, he's just behind the curtain. And there's a table with some bottles on it. And Michael picks one of these bottles up with this clear liquid in it, unscrews it and has a drink, thinks it's water, but in fact it was turpentine. And all Graham could hear was, "My God, you're trying to poison me from the wings," and so it was full of stories like that, was Graham, and he wasn't everybody's cup of tea, like you said. I remember we went to a conference in Brighton, Graham and I, and there was the skeptical community was waiting for us after dinner. So we sat with them, and I tell you what, about 2 o'clock in the morning, they threw the towel in and went to bed. And Graham sat there with this huge grin on his face. And I was thinking, don't waste your time, gentlemen, because it's only going to be one winner,
I've got one for you too. On one visit there, Graham asked me if I wanted to take a drive so that we could get a position and look down at the Menwith Hill NSA, the National Security Agency, super secret listening post. And for some of you, you know that these listening posts, part of the apparatus, so that you can't even see which direction the antennas of the radars are turned. It looks like a giant golf ball on top of a building. This structure was legendary to me. And I had, I don't know if I can say, gotten myself into some trouble with the NSA, but they knew who I was, and I knew that they knew who I was, and it was not a comfortable situation for me for some years. Be that as it may, of course I wanted to see this. And we take a drive and we come to an overlook. And there it is, a mile or two away, but, very dramatic looking. And great, let's go home or whatever. He said, "You want to get a little closer?" I'm thinking, well, yes and no. And off he goes. And he's not stopping. And at a certain point, I ask him, "Is this safe?" "Don't worry, mate, it'll be fine." But I'm having my doubts as we approach the actual inner area and the building itself. And Graham pulls up right in front of the facility. And there are two American security people with their machine guns at the ready at the door, and they simply come toward us. Of course, toward my side of the car. The bullets will go through me first before they hit Graham. And they bend down and they look at me with a look as serious as a heart attack, with the barrels of their guns down. And then they look beyond me, and I see their faces light up. "Graham, good to see you, mate. We love the last issue. What are we going to see in the next one?" It was surreal and wonderful. And there were a lot of subscribers. They're young guys doing their duty from the States, and they loved that magazine. And I recall there was a beautiful wreath that was sent by the NSA listening station at the funeral. And I'll add one more thing. The funeral was in this beautiful old church that Graham had attended, and the minister, and it was packed. There were several hundred people there. The minister, who actually knew him, sometimes that's not the case, was, as people do in eulogies, reflecting on his life and talking about his earlier years before he really found himself in the world of UFOs and, found his calling. He said at one point he worked as a meter man, ticketing automobiles in Leeds. And 1 month he received an award for issuing the most tickets. Everybody in the church involuntarily at that moment went, "Oh," and then roared with laughter. It was a very bittersweet but kind of goofy moment. We miss him, obviously. And he is emblematic of the best of us out there in the field, living an interesting life, certainly, but at the same time, fighting a fight for truth that we are all involved in. Chris, let's go back to that point where you are now well involved in this work, but it's one thing to read, to attend meetings, to develop colleagues, to write an article. it's another thing to take that next step and say, I want to do more. I want to be a facilitator. I want to, as well as a participant. But that's a big commitment. You make your living as a photographer, something that I love about you, because for me, capturing images is very special my whole life. It doesn't matter whether it's commercial or, artistic. Um, in September, my nephew is married, a lovely woman, and they had terrific professional photographers. But I had the great enjoyment of photographing the photographers, photographing the people, and the more impromptu moments. And that's going to mean something to these people. It's, where you draw part of your income, but to make that commitment to create, well, Outer Limits magazine, what happened there? What was the impetus to go beyond?
With Outer Limits magazine, the basic idea was to get information out, but get the correct information out. Information from all different aspects of, let's call it the phenomena. Where that can be UFO stories, UFO information. It can also be ghost stories. It can be strange things, parts, out of place objects, that kind of stuff. So that was basically the main reasoning, in that I wanted to get this information out. And I felt, even though there was maybe, I think at the time, there was at least one more British produced publication. But I just felt they were just concentrating on the UFO subject. But to this other publication, that everything was extraterrestrial. Now, I didn't think that at the time, and I just thought that there's a little space there to get other information out, pointing out either it could be man-made, they could be man-made, or they could be natural, etc. So I just wanted to get this information out, and also because I love the subject so much, we seem to have forgotten a lot of the early cases that have transpired over the years. For example, a lot of people, we talk about Kenneth Arnold, but Kenneth Arnold actually he saw two shapes. He didn't just see one shape. He didn't see the flying saucer. Yeah. He saw two different shapes. So it was just a case of getting reports out and the latest information out to an audience that wanted to get facts, and get facts that have proven to be investigated and true. But it's expanded over the years. I mean, I'm up to issue 47 now, which is coming. Sorry, it's 48 coming out in February, and so we're close to our 50th publication. And I'm ever so grateful for all the different pieces of information that people share, and that they are happy and willing to share with others.
Well said. We have about a minute or two left before we go to break. And again, we're going to come back and move into the area of your book, and also Flying Disc Press and the many books that they publish. Where, number one, we'll go over this information again, but Philip, what is the digital address, so to say, of Flying Disc Press, so people can visit there and see the books that you publish?
Yeah, it's easily just, www. Flying Disc Press, disc with a K, so flyingdiscpress.com, and you'll find us wherever you are.
And Chris, Outer Limits Magazine, where can people go to find out more about the magazine or subscribe?
For more information on the magazine and all things OLM, visit www.olm-mag.co.uk.
Beautiful. Gentlemen, we are about to go to break. This is Peter Robbins. My special guests for this first show of 2024 are Mr. Chris Evers and Mr. Philip Mantle from beautiful Yorkshire, England. And we will be back in a few minutes. Don't go away.
Are we alone in the universe? The most important question facing humanity is on the verge of being settled once and for all. The Mutual UFO Network has been at the forefront of this journey for nearly 50 years. Our members worldwide are dedicated to the research, documentation, and awareness that will shape the future of humanity. Won't you join us?
And we are back. The show is Meanwhile here on Earth. And my special guests are Chris Evers and Philip Mantle. And there they is. Gentlemen, I hope you had a wonderful break. Got to take a nap, make a sandwich, walk around the block. Let's pick up with you, Philip. When we met in 1997, you had just published your first book. Your co-author, Carl Neglis. How do I pronounce the last name?
Carl Negatis.
Okay. Was one of the first books on, not UFOs, of course, but the UFO abduction phenomena that I'm aware of to be published in the UK. Back then, this was considered, pretty cutting edge, to put it mildly, and certainly remains the most complex, centrally important, mysterious, unnerving area of study, to be dispassionate in my words, part of the wider world of ufology or UFO studies. Why did you decide to write that book as your was your first UFO book?
Yeah. I mean, Carl was a leading, what we call Fleet Street journalist in his time. And I'd done a couple of articles with Carl, and he lived near London, but he was originally from Cheshire, which is up to the up our way, really. And then he finished working for the news media and set up his own public relations business. And he was working with a TV production company in London. And they said to him, we want to do a documentary on alien abductions in the UK. So Carl says, I know just the man, myself. So we worked with this company to do an outline of it. And I arranged a few interviews and things like that. But in the end, they pulled the plug. For whatever reason, they said, no thanks. Sure. So I said to Carl, we've done so much work. Yes, we got paid for it, but I said it'd be a shame. This would make a great book. And he says, hang on a minute. One of my other clients is a publisher. So I said, I'll tell you what, you ask him if he's interested. And if he is, we'll do the book together. They said, yes, please. So what happened was I had some files already, but this was pre-internet days, Peter, when we started. And I would literally get in the car and I would be off. And I interviewed people in Scotland, in Wales, in England. The only reason I didn't go to Ireland is because I didn't have anybody to interview there. If there'd been somebody, I would have been across on the ferry, no problem. Yeah. And I would write all this up. I would send it to Carl, and he was responsible for putting the manuscript together, being a professional journalist. Sure. It makes sense. He did a couple of interviews himself. He moved back up this way. We published it. And as far as I'm aware, I still think it's the only book on UK abductions alone, because I also involved our great friend, Bud Hopkins. There was one particular case that was ongoing. She was having a number of experiences, and I would interview this lady, transcribe everything, literally put a transcript in the post and send it to Bud. Bud would write back and say, ask her this and ask her that, So it was a great little collaboration in that respect.
Yes.
And that was it. And that we were up and running as far as publishing was concerned. Somehow it got published in Romania and Italy. And in the States. They did an American version. And some years later, in fact, just a couple of years ago, I did a revised edition.
Yes.
So I updated it, and I'm pleased to announce, again, this came out of the blue. A company in France wants to publish it in French, and the contract is signed, and you know, and away we go. But my wife used to say, "What time will you be home?" I said, "I'm not even sure what time I'm going to get there. Never mind be home." You know, I used to have a kit bag. I had a bag with camera, film, batteries, tape recorder, notebook, pens, extra batteries, etc. And that would just go in the back of the car, and I would be off, you know. And I'm grateful I did, Peter, because you can't beat meeting these people in person.
Yes.
Sitting them down and looking them in the face. I remember one young guy in a place called Pwllheli in northwest Wales. He's called David Brown in the book. That's not his real name, but he was only a young fella. And I sat him down, and he told me that, and the location wasn't far from where we met. So I said, "Can we go there and take a couple of photos?" There is nothing there. It was just a field. But I have a picture of David stood like this.
You know,
and I didn't realize it until I'd taken the photograph and had it developed. He clearly did not want to be there, you know. And I apologize later. When the book came out, Peter, I sent him a copy.
Yes.
He acknowledged the receipt. And then I think it was 3 years later, he wrote to me and said, "I finally read the book."
Not uncommon.
And he said, "I've actually had hypnotherapy, not hypnosis, because he could remember everything that had happened. I won't go into the story, and he said, but I had nightmares. And I tried everything. And in the end, he turned to hypnotherapy to relieve him of the nightmares. And he'd now got married himself and started a young family. So it took him 3 years to go back and look at that book. And I find that amazing. That to me says more about the experience and the phenomenon than anything else. It really does.
And you have really set the stage here for one of the most important aspects, I think, of this discussion that I've been looking forward to so much with you guys. Over the past few decades, not even counting the last 7 years or so, that this subject has taken off like a skyrocket in terms of its greater acceptance every day by more and more people around the world, more government officials around the world, bureaucrats, etc., that there was a time, and it went on for 70 years or so, where flying saucers, UFOs, but that term unfortunately chosen by the media in the summer of 47 to shorthand this phenomena, was a godsend to ridicule, and ridicule toward the subject in general, toward individuals who felt they had witnessed a truly anomalous UFO, and certainly toward anybody who felt that, in terms of the public mindset, generally speaking, that I've been captured by aliens and they've taken me to their craft and they've examined me and returned me, and this has happened to me before and it's real. That used to be considered a presenting sign for mental illness, being a con man or somebody who is trying to get one over on the public, being mystical, being very New Age, welcome the Space Brothers. But in fact, and it is key, I think, as we continue this process that's generally become known as disclosure with a capital D, that at the center of it, more people than any of us are comfortable with credibly have established, as well as one can, that they have been taken. And you guys know me well. My first notoriety was not so much for work that I was doing, but work that I was assisting on, that the pioneer UFO abduction investigator, really the founder of the scientific study of this phenomena within the greater UFO phenomena, Bud Hopkins, let me be a fly on the wall, so to say. And over the years, separate from my own investigations and contacts, meet with, spend time with, sometimes witness and hypnotic regression, meet with family members, see physical evidences of a wide assortment of people who were, as the term has come to evolve, abductees. I guess the point I'm getting to here that I'd like your reactions on is we have colleagues who, very professional, but every once in a while I get the sense that, yeah, abduction here, this is a good case. I spoke to this person, and, that we either become uncomfortable with or tend to forget. This is really happening. This is not some complex psychological aberration combined with sleep paralysis or watching too much science fiction or having an overactive imagination. This is really happening. And several times a year, and I'm thankful for it, kind of out of nowhere sometimes, it hits me again. Good God, this really is happening. And of course, in my case, I became involved almost against my will and obsessed for years with the greater subject because well over 40 years, my sister Helen told me about conscious memories of an abduction before there was really hardly any literature on it. And it led me into the life that I've lived. Do you find in your contacts with people as leading public figures in this work in the UK that people still in general are hesitant about this subject, that it is taken more seriously, and your own personal internal take on it in terms of not getting hardened to it or thinking blasé, oh yeah, it's an abduction case. It's such, as writers, we're all sensitive to language. And that word case often makes me, it's like pinning a bug to a board, It's so dispassionate. And at the center of this is a world of uncharted feelings, from absolute terror to beatific feelings. Because, of course, we know, even though it's not our research specialties, there are so many people who more and more come forward with transcendent, positive, beatific experiences. These are their experiences. So I'm kind of yammering on and not being sharply defining the question.
I mean,
jump right in there.
Yeah, I mean, the so-called disclosure lobby. I don't need to mention any names. We all know who these people are. If you look at it, Peter, and I believe this is being done on purpose, there is no mention of encounters, abductions, whatever you would like to call them. They are being, penciled out of the debate, pretty much like they were back in the 1960s. Because in the 1950s, the argument was, are they ours or are they not? And the ufologists of the day didn't want to admit to being extraterrestrial because it would take away the scientific interest. Then in the 60s, when we have Betty Hill, well, okay, there are these things, but we can't say that they're doing this to ordinary people who are driving home from their holiday. So there was then the reluctance to talk about abductions, and that moved on. We've gone full circle. And now the disclosure lobby, and you take David Grush, for example, whether you believe him or not is up to you, but there is not one mention anywhere of abductions. He'll say that, you know, the authorities have murdered people to keep these secrets quiet, and that's all right. That's acceptable. But there's not a whiff. Same with Leslie Keane. You know Leslie, she was a friend of Bud's. I like Leslie. But again, if you listen to what she's writing and talking about now, it's, you know, abductions are being censored, Peter, because they want to keep the so-called Arrow and NASA's involvement, you know. But so to talk about people having these experiences might you know, work against that. And you know, so I'm grateful that I've spoken to these people down the years, and I've sat with them, and they are not looking for, you know, the headlines. They have no idea what the hell happened to them. Like the lady I corresponded with Bud about, she was just an ordinary housewife, Peter, with a little girl and a husband who was a motor mechanic, you know, and they go to the local pub on a weekend, and, you know, that, you know, an ordinary life. And she says, these things have been happening to me. I told my family first. Then I went, what do you want me to do? I went to see my doctor. He gave me tranquilizers, and they didn't work because these things still kept happening. So I was the last resort, you know. And she was very grateful that I would actually sit down and listen to what she had to say. If nothing else, I was the first to actually sit down and let her talk and tell me what was happening, you know. And I found that a great privilege, and still do. As you know, I've been involved with Calvin Parker from the Pascagoula case. Sadly, Calvin passed away last August.
That's right.
And we uncovered so much information.
Did you ever?
even as we speak, you know, other things have been uncovered that we didn't previously have access to. For example, Calvin's hypnosis with Dr. James Harder 2 days after the event. And I have that recording set on my laptop now. Of course, Bud Hopkins, our mutual friend Bud, he hypnotized both Charlie and Calvin at different times. Didn't know that when we set off on this story. I have those recordings. I have transcribed them, and I have listened to them. And it's a funny part, but I'm here with my Yorkshire accent. I had to buy a cassette player to play these things when I got them. They weren't digitized. I actually got copies of the cassette sent. So I'm listening as a Yorkshireman. You have Calvin under hypnosis with his Mississippi accent. Then you had Bud with his New York accent. So it would take me 20 minutes to figure out what the hell they were talking about in the first place. Because then they would throw in things that are clearly only in America. You know, Calvin says there was a tag on the license plate of a car. What the hell is a tag? You know, he says, we went to a tiki bar. I'm thinking, what the hell is a tiki bar? You know, and I emailed Calvin, and all he could do was laugh. You know, and then you get the serious side of it. When you listen to Bud taking these gentlemen back. Now, Calvin was a tough, hard-working fella.
Oh, yeah.
When you listen to the tape and he screams, and I mean scream, the only time I've ever heard that kind of scream before, Peter, as I said, I've suffered with heart complaints since 1999 when I had a heart attack. I was taken into what you call the emergency room, into Leeds one year, into the general infirmary that's known, and you're separated only by curtains. So I'm in the emergency room, I'm laid there, and there was a lot of activity, and they moved me a bit. And where I was sitting, you could see outside was the scanner they used for the x-rays. So they turned the light on and they'll put the x-rays on this machine, they could see them. And they're yelling, if we've got to do this, we've got to do that, we're going to lose him. We're going to lose him. And then from 3 or 4 places up from where I am, you hear this scream. And it's a young man that has just died. And that was his mother screaming. She was at his bedside. Wow. And so when I heard Calvin scream, I thought, I've heard that scream before, you know.
I know that you know that Calvin was a friend of mine going back to the 1980s when he worked with Bud. And in the late 80s, he on his own put together a conference down in Pascagoula. Um, Deb White Cabell was one of the other speakers. I maybe Stan Friedman as well. But at a point when there was clear time, he took me back to where it happened. And I walked the walk with him and he told me the story. Of course, that was still when poor Calvin was deep in denial and dealing with it to a certain degree by just trying to bury himself in alcohol. Charlie was terribly concerned about him. And of course, Calvin originally was the friend of Charlie's son.
Yeah,
And so there's kind of a fatherly relationship there.
Yeah.
But that thing, like if you listen to the original recordings of Barney Hill undergoing regressive, that scream.
Absolutely.
And I'll go one further. Because of my years working in the theater in New York, I had occasion to meet so many wonderful actors, many of them well known. And one afternoon, I got to spend a little time with James Earl Jones. And because I was house manager, not an actor, and we had a couple of quiet minutes, I just said, what was it like preparing for that part? Because he made a film with the great American actress Estelle Parsons about the events that had happened to Betty and Barney Hill. Trying to remember whether it's the exact name of it. It was a made-for-TV movie.
It's called the UFO incident.
That simple, yeah, the UFO incident in the mid-'70s, I think. And I don't think it would have been very successful as a feature theater release. It was just too damn anxiety-provoking that even with, no special effects, but small people wearing masks that were not terribly convincing, it didn't matter. The acting was brilliant and very powerful. Before I go to Chris and ask him the question, I want to play devil's advocate for a moment on your observations to start with, that frustration that leading figures in UFO crossover world journalism are not talking about abductions, but other aspects of UFO stuff. For me, I think that's a conscious decision in this period of time, knowing human psychology enough to understand you can overload somebody's circuits with too much intense information, and sometimes it has to be staged. I'd like to think that Leslie and Ralph Blumenthal and leading figures in the work, also in ufology per se, without necessarily being journalists, who are focusing on other aspects of it, are doing so consciously and not to repress the information, as opposed to, wait a bit, we have a world now starting to digest this material on a more deadly serious way without that fear of ridicule, which is incredibly liberating. And I'm optimistic that over the next few years, we will see a change in that, Philip. Time will tell, of course. Chris, same question to you. The difference between a UFO witness and a UFO experiencer, or somebody who an investigation, a serious investigation confirms for you, has been taken. And most people aren't aware, of course, that the evidences that support that are often as physical and as real and as multiply layered as a serious felony brought to a court of law, that it's not just taking somebody's word for it. But
over the years, we've had a lot of different kind of evidence. Well, first of all, I just want to talk about the abduction phenomena.
Yes,
I
please.
have not really investigated deeply the abduction phenomena. All I will say is we have ordinary people experiencing extraordinary events. Now, somebody once said to me, what's the best evidence? in your opinion? Well, I said the best evidence, in my opinion, is what I have seen with my own eyes.
Yes.
It cannot be argued against, really, when you think about it. But when we look as well at things like the National UFO Reporting Center, which is an American organization,
Yes.
only one organization. We've got many different organizations over there in the States. We've got MUFON. In Britain, we've got BUFORA, British UFO Research Association, who I don't think are really deeply that involved anymore, which is a shame. But when you look at NUFORC, the National UFO Reporting Center, up until November of the year 2022, they had, in their 47 years of existence, over 147,000 cases reported to them. Now, not all of them cases, not everybody is going to be trying to lie, con, cheat, or they're after their 15 minutes of fame, as Andy Warhol once said. A lot of these cases are the real deal. And when it comes down to what you were just talking a moment ago about they're not looking into the abduction phenomena, don't believe it. They are looking into it, but what they're looking for is an excuse to push it under the carpet. How the hell are they going to explain it? That is the problem. How the hell are they going to explain it?
Well, if you take the Pascagoula case, for example, please allow me a plug for my book, Beyond Reasonable Doubt, the Pascagoula Alien Abduction. If you take that case on its own, you have two witnesses, Charlie and Calvin. Within hours of the encounter happening, they're being interviewed in Jackson County Sheriff's Department, who have told them in no uncertain terms, if you're pulling our leg, you're in big trouble. You're going to end up in jail. Obviously they weren't. They were then interviewed the following day at Keesler Air Force Base. We have a full transcript of that. At the time, there were other witnesses came forward. One of a chap called Larry Booth, he owned a local gas station, but there were others. So I met Calvin in 2018. When I say met, we met, online. We started to work on his book. Out of nowhere came a colleague who we're now friends with called Stephanos in Greece. Stephanos in 1981 was in the Greek Merchant Navy. He was a radio operator, and they docked in Pascagoula, and he was a UFO researcher. He went and interviewed Charles Hickson, but he also got an interview with another gentleman, Pastor Emmanuel Sigalas, who also witnessed something that night of the 11th of October 1973. So we thought, here's another witness, and on we went, and we found more witnesses. Others stepped forward. We then found that both Charlie and Calvin had been under regression with Bud. I think you told me that, Peter, if I'm not mistaken, at some point. I managed to access copies of their tapes. So we have that. Then when the town of Pascagoula, a charity there raised enough money to put a memorial, in a historical plaque at the place. Sure. Which was unveiled by the mayor. Two people stepped forward, Mr. and Mrs. Blair. We found them by their daughter mentioning online. She said, my mum and dad were on the opposite side of the river that night, and they too saw the UFO. So I contacted this lady. She put me in touch with their parents, Mr. and Mrs. Blair, and they were indeed on the opposite side of the river. Mr. Blair worked on the oil rigs, so he was going out on a boat, and he was just waiting for his captain to arrive. He was late. He was miserable, trying to sleep in the car. And Mrs. Blair said, see this blue thing coming down the river. She thought it was using the river as some kind of navigation point. And she says it stopped, and she said it either seemed as if it didn't know where it was, or if it was looking for something. And she said if it was an airplane, there's no airfield there. She knew the area. So she's then they decided to put Mr. Blair's belongings on the boat. His boss still hadn't come. They're walking down this little pier, and there's a splash in the water, and this, as she called it, grey man came up out of the water in front of her, scared the bejesus out of her, went back into the water and didn't come back up. She ran up to the boat. This was about 9 p.m., threw his belongings on it, and then decided to go. She had to go back down the pier where this thing had been to get to the car. She got back to the car, Peter. It was midnight. Where did the 3 hours go? So I spoke to her on the phone briefly. I passed her on to my research partner, Dr. Irina Scott, who lives in Ohio. Irina rang her, and when it came to this part on the pier and this grey thing, she got really emotional about it. And I mean, really, emotional. We move on a couple of years. Mr. Blair takes seriously ill. He's in the hospital, going to have an operation. He doesn't think he's going to make it. He insists that his wife, Maria, phone me from the hospital on the mobile, or the cell phone, as you call it. And he said, Philip, I've been lying. I too saw it that night, and I saw the grey creatures, just as Maria was saying. I've been lying. I just wanted to protect her. I didn't want people to think we're nuts. Fortunately for him, he did survive the operation. He then told Maria that they too had been abducted that night. And he told us some of the story. And he carried on telling the story, Peter, to the very day he died.
Yes.
And Maria said, well, I've got to admit, Philip, I saw what happened to Charlie and Calvin. I could see it from where we were. But she said, my husband, in those days, Peter, there were different times. If your husband says, don't do this, she didn't do it.
Yeah. I want to stop you there for a moment because there's one subject that we really haven't gotten into yet that is a big impetus. It has to do with this.
Chris's first book. Notice I say first because I don't think it will be the last. I said that on purpose.
No, I don't think there's a chance of that. Also, our dear friend Ronnie Kinsella, who did this brilliant cover. And Chris, for me, as a fan of literature and film that touches on this subject, I thought it was really quite wonderful to kind of honor H.G. Wells with this variation on the title of one of his greatest novels. Mm-hmm. I wanted to begin some discussion of this book by reading a small part of it that I actually had the honor of writing, part of the foreword.
Just before you do that, Peter, can I please thank you for your very, very kind words. Now, 3, 2, 1, go.
I know, and that 5-pound note will be in the mail shortly. Never let it be said that individuals are incapable of altering the course of history, especially if their efforts and contributions to their chosen cause come at a moment in time when interest and awareness in their subject happens to be expanding exponentially. Having spent a good part of the last 40 years involved in UFO research, study, and investigation, I can say with some confidence that every year, for going on at least a decade now, more and more people care less and less what other people think about what they think about the subject of truly anomalous flying objects and their implications for humanity. And that's a good thing to all but the secret keepers, that elite clique who have, to one degree or another, always moved the pieces on history's chessboard. For those of us who have been around long enough to see real change in the public's and officialdom's increasingly respectful take on and treatment of the matter, it's gratifying to see a new generation of relevant writers, researchers, and investigators establishing themselves as published authors, and in doing so, helping to advance our collective knowledge of this most enigmatic subject. This is particularly the case with Chris Evers' insightful, reasoned, and brilliantly researched The Shape of Things to Come. And you earned every one of those words, Chris.
Thank you.
I wanted first for you to talk about the genesis. I mean, obviously, all of your background led to you writing this book. But what was it? Was there some impetus, a moment where you went from thinking, yeah, maybe someday I'll write a book, to I'm writing a book?
Yeah.
What happened there to
It
bring
was
this book into reality for us?
basically, I think, as you mentioned previously, or we've talked about previously, Peter, I did step away from the subject for a number of years. Roundabout, it was actually after Graham passed on that it was actually me and Phil, we actually met at the very last UFO magazine conference in Leeds, and so I got to spend the afternoon with him. Blow the rest of the presentations, I'm going to sit and talk to this guy. He knows what he's on about, Anyway, excuse me. So I come back to the subject around about 2014, and I realised, of course, that a hell of a lot of things had happened in my stepping away and coming back. So in reality, even though I've been back 3 or 4 years already when I started to write the book, it was more or less me swatting up on the different stories and cases and things that have occurred within the world of ufology. So that was the real reason behind the writing of the book. And then in the first part of the book, I talk about Hynek's classification system. Most of us know it CE1, CE2, CE3, full stop. And of course, we're aware nowadays up to CE5, Stephen Greer, etc. But in fact, it goes on, in my opinion, up to CE8, which are all described in the books. I wrote that down. And then halfway through writing that, I thought, well, hang on a minute, nobody's ever done a book, as far as I'm aware, about the different shapes of the craft that have been seen. So I thought, well, that might be interesting. So I did it as I wrote the book as a bit of swatting up for myself. For me, it doesn't matter if you've been in the subject. I think us three here must have something like 120, 130, 40 years worth of experience within the subject, and that's just Phil on his own. And it's
you look good for that age.
At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're brand new to the subject. It doesn't matter if you've been involved for 50 years like I have this year. It's good to get a refresher course and bring these different events back to our memories and to our minds. But I will say, I've deliberately kept away from Kenneth Arnold's. I think I mentioned it briefly in the introduction, and I've stayed away from Roswell, and I've definitely stayed away from Rendlesham. I've concentrated on the many, many other different types of sightings. There's even lenticular clouds in there. Not a lot, but there's a little bit about lenticular clouds in there and how they can form and how they can, manufacture themselves, usually in mountain areas or desert areas.
Yeah. I want to stop you there for a moment and go to Philip on 2 counts. At a certain point, Philip, you decided to take that step from being certainly a well-known and well-respected UFO investigator, researcher, author, public speaker, documentary participant repeatedly, a real presence in the field, and make a decision based on personal passion and a business decision to establish a publishing company, Flying Disc Press, to specialize in books around this subject. Now, without setting up anything awkward, I think it's fair to say that as a professional, if you received a manuscript from a friend or a colleague or an acquaintance that you knew and liked, but it was not up to your standards, that can be awkward if they want you to publish the book. And we've all been there one way or another. At a certain point, you got Chris's manuscript and you decided to publish it. First of all, again, what was that impetus to become a publisher? And second, why Chris's book?
Yeah, good question, Peter. I mean, down the years, I've done all kinds of stuff, Peter, as you well know, and I know people all over the place. I've been magazine editor as well. In 2015, I received a manuscript from a friend of mine called Peter Cielabius in Poland. And he wasn't looking for it to be published. Peter's spoken English was very good. He wanted to practice his written English. So he wrote, he's a UFO researcher. He's actually a magazine editor now. He said, will you have a read of it, Philip, and give me some feedback on my written English? Of course I will. So I read it. And I thought, hellfire, this is a damn... there's only one incident in this whole book I've ever heard of. So I read it and I gave him some feedback. Now, a friend of mine called John Hansen had already set up Haunted Skies. He publishes his own books.
Yes.
And I told him about the book. He said, well, why don't you publish it? I said, well, I don't know how to do it. So John gave me the basics of how to do this.
Well done, John.
So I jumped in with both feet. I called it Flying Disc from the early days, site, Flying Disc Press. And I published UFOs over Poland. That was the first book I published. I made a lot of mistakes. I still make some because it was a very steep learning curve, Peter. In 2016, I had more heart problems, more hospitalization.
Remember.
So I decided to take early retirement from where I worked and jump in with Flying Disc Press. Yeah. And I would carry on my own research, my own stuff as well. One of the things I wanted to do, if I could, was to encourage authors from different countries, because the language barrier, prevents us reading a lot of stuff from overseas. So I followed that up with UFOs over Romania by Dr. Dan Farkas from Romania, and I published books from Brazil, Italy, Japan. And I wanted to give first-time authors an opportunity.
Great.
I go, right, you mentioned my first book, Without Consent. We actually went down, we tried a few publishers before Carl got us the deal, and they all said no. And I kept those letters, still have them, those rejection letters.
I've got mine.
Yeah. So I thought, I'm now in a situation where hopefully I can help people not face the rejection letters, and I have published a number of first-time authors, and Chris was one of those. Chris is a very modest man. He doesn't know I'm going to, but he is very modest indeed. In fact, probably a bit too modest for his own good. And he was saying to me, well, will anybody read it? Will anybody buy it? I said, well, there's only one way to find out, isn't there? You write the damn thing and I'll publish it.
Yeah, I'll just back that up.
Please.
I was actually trying in a subtle way to get Phil to write something with me, because I'm not going to lie, everybody knows Philip Mantle. So I thought, yeah, great. I'm sure Phil
author, sure.
Work together. He's a great author, well known in the subject.
Wonderful writer.
I can get on his coattails here, really, follow him along, But we was working together at that time anyway, doing our own podcast and so on and so forth. And what Phil has just said, if you write it, I will publish it. And then he turned around and said, how does that sound? So I said, yeah, all right then, okay. But it still took me 18 months to 2 years to get the bandwagon moving and actually make.
But that's the way I work, Peter. I have nobody looking over my shoulder. It's just me. Yeah. And I say to all our authors, here's the contract, sign it. But if you change your mind, we can scrap it tomorrow. It is there. And it doesn't matter if your manuscript comes in 3 months or 6 months' time or 2 years' time. Whenever it's ready, it's ready. And then we'll publish it. I have a gentleman friend in Canada who's been trying to write his book on the Philadelphia experiment for at least 5 years and still hasn't gotten round to it because he's had a lot of family problems. But now he's in a good place and hopefully we might see it. But again, if it does, great. If it doesn't, there you go. My door is always open. So when Chris said he got an idea for a book, I said, well, okay, mate, now you've said it. Well, it's a bit like Calvin. But when I first spoke to Calvin Parker, I think it was the second phone call, he said, I've already started writing a book. He was trying to put me off. was trying to get rid of me, Peter. I thought, he made a mistake there. Or, I'll send you a contract. And of course, his wife, Waynette, saw it, and that was it. The deal was done. So, I like to encourage first-time authors from different countries. I can't afford to pay for translation, I'm afraid. I just don't have the money for that. So if we can have it in English, that's great. And it's not always a commercial decision either, Peter. I will publish something simply because I think it deserves to be published. It's a gentleman from the States called John Steiger. John actually wrote 3 UFO plays. And I published
yes, I remember. Of course, I remember now.
And it's called the UFO trilogy. And I read them and I love them. And I can actually, this is your field, Peter, but I can actually visualize them being performed on the stage as I read it. And I thought, well, we'll never probably sell a lot of copies, but bugger me, I'm going to publish it. And it's still on sale now, and Johnny was over the moon with it, So it's not all about money.
No, it can't be. And the fact that more people worldwide read less and less for pleasure and only when they have to for business, preferring the instant gratification of, a video or some other kind of visual entertainment, for me is very unnerving. The written word and the passion to read, not just for information, but for pleasure, is an endangered species. And, we are foot soldiers in doing all we can to keep the book, so to say, front and center, whether it's,
I think we might be on the right track, Peter, because we've seen a resurgence in vinyl records, for example.
Yes, and I'm observing more and more people who are passionate about building libraries.
Yeah, today's generation, and I have 2 daughters and I have grandchildren. Today's generation are the disposable one. You just click, download, that's it. But when you and I used to go to the record store and when we'd buy that piece of vinyl or that book, we'd sit. I used to go to the coffee bar afterwards and I'd sit, and it was like I got the Holy Grail in my hands. And now, of course, I would read all the stuff on the back as if I knew what the hell I was talking about, but I really didn't. And I think this current generation is realizing we don't have those experiences. Yeah. It's a download and throw away and delete. And hang on a minute. My youngest daughter, Shona, is 30.
I'm going to cut you off for one moment to say, I'm sure you both remember several years back, I think it was during the pandemic, the absolutely brilliant, touching, wonderful, original series, The Detectorists.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Which for anybody that's ever dreamt of, walking around with an electronic detector and finding some amazing coin or piece of jewelry, it was so human and so affecting and so touching. But the word, of course, which is the way they refer to themselves, is a quirky sounding word. And some months ago, I was fortunate enough to come across a Facebook page called The Librarianist, I think it is. And it's simply people from all over the world, and I mean all over the world, posting photographs of their home libraries. Mm-hmm. It can be a small shelf, with 3 dozen books, or it can be rooms, jaw-droppingly organized and beautifully arranged. I love it, and it makes me feel part of a fraternity. That, other people, you have so many books, not nearly enough, and never will.
No, you can't have enough books, Peter. And like I said, my youngest daughter, when she was at university, I said, I'll buy you a Kindle, to download. No, it was no. Even for her studies, it had to be, in paper format. And she loves all the classics, Dickens, H.G. Wells,
wonderful.
Mary Shelley, Frankenstein.
They're still worth reading.
But the classics, and they're all on a bookshelf. And then at the end of it is mine. My latest book. There's Dad's latest book. I think she only puts that there when I go and see her. You know what I mean? She takes it out when I've gone. But so I think we might be lucky. And there's a resurgence in having those things in your hands, not just on a machine in front of you. Exactly. And that is vinyl records, cassette tapes, books, and so on. Because if you don't, you're missing out. You really are missing out, because they are a sensory thing.
And as you said, you grew up in modest circumstances, but those two irreplaceable things in place. You were loved and you knew it.
Yeah.
You grew up in a community that was a community and that you felt part of, and that you grew up in a house with books in it.
Absolutely.
It's incalculable the difference this can
I've
make.
always had that curiosity, Peter. Up until I had the heart attack, I worked for 21 years in a factory. A big, smelly place, but I loved it. I was the shop steward there as well. And I was one of those guys that if there's a big red button on a machine and it says don't touch, I'd want to know what happened if I did touch it. I wouldn't touch it. I would ask. And I'll give you an example. I was being trained on this huge, great, smelly plant, belching out smoke. And the manager says, this thing goes through here. You flick this lever and you lift this thing up for 17 seconds. Then you put it back down again. And I said, well, why the hell 17 seconds? And he looked at me and he says, Philip, I've been training people to use this material for 10 years. You're the first one that's ever asked me. They all just did it automatically. I wanted to know what would happen if I did it for only 15 seconds or 20 seconds. Curiosity.
Philip, let me ask you. You've published many books at this point. You've read many UFO books. You're very knowledgeable on the subject. What distinguishes this book for you, different than any book that you published, and why you feel people should add it to their libraries? Because, another UFO book. Maybe not. Why this?
Well, I think it's because we have an author here in Chris who has a long history in the subject. Maybe those few years out did him a favor, because he comes back into it and he can take a fresh look at the subject. It's a bit like you're doing a painting, Peter, and you get halfway through it and you think, it's rubbish. I'll put it in the attic. And a couple of years later, you take it out and thinking, it's not that bad. Maybe I should finish it off, And you take, but you get a fresh perspective on it. That's the word I'm looking for. I think Chris has been able to look at the UFO subject and do exactly that. And the book is available for those that think they know it all, because I'll tell you something, you don't, and nobody does, and for newcomers alike. So if you're a newcomer, you'll not get lost in this book.
Yes.
It's a different way, and it's a new perspective of looking at the subject. And as Chris pointed out, we have these observations by people from around the world, but nobody had really said, hold on a minute, look at these things. Look at the shapes they are. Is this telling us something? And it's all in that book.
One thing that isn't in the book, isn't in any book that I'm aware of, but how can I say, it causes one to reflect on the overall subject of that area of UFO, UAP phenomena that are specifically machines from parts unknown, terribly advanced technologically beyond, I think, some of our wildest dreams. And it kind of reactivated my imagination when I got the manuscript for Chris's book, beginning with the title. Again, it's one thing to work off a famous title, but this was perfectly thought out. The shape of things to come from elsewhere. What we're talking about here in three-dimensional, real-world, undeniable terms is that there are locations out there, to be fairly general, where on different planets, on a moon, large asteroids, possibly well underground, there are factories. And they make, I would imagine, because we certainly do it at this point with automobiles and everything else, automated assembly lines that manufacture these machines and have since probably before there was a humanity. The reality of the question, why all the different shapes? Well, my first thought is, let's take a look at the history of the automobile. Question answered. These are conveyances. They're updated. They change as technology changes. I'm making totally educated guesses here. As we know, it's those people who say, let me tell you the definitive facts. This is where this factory is located. This is what, the history of these intelligences that are making it. This is why they're coming to Earth. This is for how many 100,000 years they've been coming. This is what they have for breakfast. This is all speculation. Many people put it forward as alleged fact. Other people choose to believe it. And you have a cult of belief. As, Bud Hopkins used to say in so many words, for debunkers and skeptics, we're just, silly believers in nonsense that can all be explained away. But in fact, for us, and Bud used to kind of in mock awe of people like Philip Klass, aren't they amazing? They actually know that there's no such thing as UFOs. I'm in awe, how we should, seek more knowledge from them, because we're still trying to wrap our heads around the basic phenomena. And beyond guesswork, it's all pretty speculative. The shape of things to come, specifically around these craft, is in fact a function of manufacturing. That's kind of a mundane note to end on, but in fact, gentlemen, we are out of time. Dear friends Chris Evers and Philip Mantle, it's not only been a pleasure having you on this first episode of the new year of Meanwhile Here on Earth. It's just great to start the new year with you both. And may it be a year filled with love, work, and knowledge for all of us, and may all things being equal. Folks, register for the next OLM conference coming up in September, that if we have enough registrants, we will all get to have some fun together and learn and share in September in the great city of Hull. Peter Robbins here, Chris Evers, Philip Mantle. The show is Meanwhile Here on Earth. See you next week.
Thank you, Peter.